As Jamal Freeman navigates his posh neighborhood in his sleek, black Porsche, he's enveloped in a sense of pride and accomplishment. Little does he know that his world is about to be upended by a seemingly routine traffic stop. What transpires next will challenge his perceptions of justice and equality to their very core. Officer Karen Michaels is on patrol, her gaze sweeping across the immaculate lawns and grandiose houses. She can't shake off a disquieting feeling as she observes the residents, her old prejudices coloring her view. When Jamal's car appears in her line of sight, something seems amiss. She narrows her eyes and makes her decision. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror jolts Jamal from his tranquil thoughts. His brow creases as he pulls his car to the side of the road, oblivious to the ordeal that awaits him. An invisible yet palpable tension hangs in the air. As Officer Michaels approaches the vehicle, her hands rest on her holster, signaling an immediate readiness for confrontation. Her stern demeanor exudes suspicion as she nears the driver's side window. Jamal's heart pounds, but he maintains a calm exterior, fully aware of the risks of displaying any signs of agitation. However, what happens next is entirely unexpected and terrifying. License and registration, Michaels demands, her voice laced with an edge that suggests this is far from a routine stop. Jamal complies without hesitation, his movements deliberate and measured as he retrieves the requested documents from the glove compartment. As he hands them over, he can't help but notice the officer's suspicious gaze, her eyes darting between his face and the luxury vehicle he occupies. Michaels examines the documents with exaggerated thoroughness, her brow furrowed in disbelief. "This is your car?" she asks, clearly skeptical. Jamal nods, fighting to keep his voice steady as he responds, "Yes, it is." The officer's eyes narrow, unconvinced. "Step out of the vehicle," she orders, her free hand now firmly gripping her holster. Jamal's composure wavers for a moment as confusion and fear wash over him. He takes a deep breath, reminding himself of his rights. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" he inquires, his tone respectful yet filled with growing unease. Michael's posture stiffens, her voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "You fit the description of a suspect in a recent robbery," she states, the accusation hanging heavy in the air, each word a blow to Jamal's dignity. He feels a surge of anger rising within him, but knows that expressing it could worsen the situation. Slowly, Jamal opens the car door, his movements careful. As he stands, he becomes acutely aware of curious neighbors emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Their gazes move between him and the officer, a mix of concern and judgment painting their faces. Michaels begins to pat Jamal down, her touch rough and impersonal. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" Her words drip with accusation. The question stings Jamal, as it's clear this is happening solely because of the color of his skin. Jamal struggles to maintain his composure as the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood washes over him. He can feel the weight of the onlookers' stares, their whispers carrying on the breeze. His mind races, torn between asserting his rights and avoiding any action that could be seen as resistance. Officer Michaels, sensing the growing audience, seems to double down on her actions. Her movements become more aggressive, her voice louder, as if to justify her suspicions to the gathering crowd. "Spread your legs," she barks, kicking at Jamal's feet to widen his stance. Jamal closes his eyes for a moment and calms himself. When he opens them, his gaze is steady, his voice well controlled. "I have rights," he says, each word measured and clear. Officer Michaels asks, "Who do you want me to call?" Jamal thinks of the neighbors he's known for years. He turns, hoping for support, but sees Mrs. Johnson from across the street step out onto her porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She's known him since he was a boy, watching him grow into the respectable young man he is now, yet her brow furrows as she takes in the scene. Nearby, Mr. Patel, usually smiling from his corner store, leans against his doorframe with uncertainty in his eyes. Jamal's gaze pleads for their help, but their hesitation betrays him. Jamal's mind races as he stands there, hands still raised. He's well aware of how this looks, a young black man being confronted by the police, treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. The urge to shout, to defend himself, to make everyone understand the injustice of the situation burns in his throat, but he swallows it down, knowing that any show of aggression could make things worse. Officer Michaels feels the pressure of the onlooker's eyes. With each passing moment, she becomes more agitated, her voice rising as she repeats her demands. The presence of the growing audience seems to harden her resolve, pushing her to exert her authority even more forcefully. Jamal takes a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He speaks slowly, his voice calm but filled with anger at the situation. The gathered neighbors exchange glances, their reactions full of judgment. Some shake their heads, muttering about kids these days and just cooperating with the police. Others stand in uncomfortable silence, unsure of how to react to the scene. As the standoff drags on, Jamal makes a decision. Feeling the pain of his neighbor's betrayal, he slowly reaches for his phone, his hand steady. "I'm calling my lawyer," he announces. Officer Michaels tenses, her hand instinctively moving towards her holster. The atmosphere grows thick with tension. Neighbors lean forward, watching intently as the situation teeters on the edge of escalation. Jamal's finger hovers over the screen, his jaw set in determination. In this moment, he's not just fighting for himself, but for every person who's ever been wrongly accused, every life turned upside down by unchecked bias. The weight of the moment settles over the street like a heavy blanket. Each person present, Jamal, Officer Michaels, and the silent observers, finds themselves at a crossroads. Their actions in the next few moments will ripple out, affecting not just this encounter, but the very fabric of their community. As the tense standoff between Jamal and Officer Michaels reaches a breaking point, a police cruiser suddenly pulls up to the scene. A superior officer steps out, his poise stern. He also had this air of authority about him. As he approaches, his eyes widen. The superior seemed like the savior who would put an end to all this. He was older, with salt and pepper hair, and a face lined by years of dealing with tense situations like this, or so Jamal thought. But something about the way he moved toward Officer Michaels, and the look exchanged between them, immediately sent a shiver down Jamal's spine. This wasn't a rescue, it was something far worse. As the superior officer came to stand beside Michaels, he looked at the scene with a slow, deliberate gaze. His eyes locked onto Jamal's, and for a moment, there was a scary silence. Then, in a voice so low and calm it was almost conversational, the superior officer said, "Well, another one trying to push his luck." Jamal's heart dropped. He had been expecting this man to bring some sense of order, to correct Officer Michaels and resolve the situation. Instead, he now realized that the man in front of him wasn't here to help. He was here to solidify the nightmare that was happening. Jamal looked at the neighbors, hoping someone would step in to help. But what he saw made him feel even worse. The neighbors, who had first come out of their houses looking confused, were now more confident and bold. They were talking amongst themselves, exchanging glances that ranged from smug satisfaction to quiet indifference. As the superior officer leaned in towards Michaels, his voice was just loud enough for Jamal to hear. "We need to take control of this situation. Request backup." Jamal's heart sank. What did they mean? He wasn't resisting. He hadn't done anything wrong. But the way the superior officer said it, so calmly and matter-of-factly, sent a terrifying message. This was about more than just his car. He was in the middle of something far darker, something he hadn't fully grasped until now. They weren't treating him like a suspect. They were treating him like a threat that needed to be neutralized. Officer Michaels smiled as she lifted her radio, requesting additional units to her location. "We have a potentially volatile situation," she said, her voice dripping with excitement. Jamal's breath almost stopped. Volatile? He had not raised his voice, yet here they were, preparing for a full show of force. He took a step backward, his eyes scanning the growing crowd of neighbors. Their faces blurred together, some of them filming the scene, others whispering amongst themselves. But none of them moved to help him. None of them seemed to care. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was utterly alone. The silence on the street was oppressive, broken only by the crackle of Officer Michael's radio. Moments later, the wail of sirens cut through the air, growing louder with each passing second. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as a second police cruiser pulled up, its flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the faces of the onlookers. Two more officers stepped out, their hands instinctively resting on their holsters as they approached the scene. Jamal watched them, trying to gauge whether they would bring some measure of reason to the situation. But the looks on their faces told him otherwise. They were here to back up their fellow officers. No questions asked. The superior officer gave them a small nod, signaling for them to position themselves around Jamal. Now there were 4 officers in total, each one standing at a different point around him, creating a circle that felt less like a protective barrier and more like a trap closing in. Jamal felt trapped between the officers and the glaring eyes of the neighborhood. But then, something in the superior officer's behavior shifted. He squinted at Jamal, as if trying to place him. For a moment, it seemed like the man was having second thoughts, but just as quickly, his face hardened again. Jamal knew this wasn't over. Then, as if by a stroke of fate, one of the newer officers, Officer Davis, who had arrived in the second cruiser, stepped forward and looked deeply at Jamal. "Wait a second," he said. "I've seen you before." Jamal swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "Where?" he asked, his heart racing with anticipation. Davis glanced between the others before slowly approaching Jamal, clearly hesitant but curious. "I've seen you at a community event, I think," he said. "You're Jamal Freeman, right?" Jamal nodded, feeling a spark of hope ignite within him. "Yeah, that's me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I volunteer at local events. I'm studying to be a judge, like my father." Davis nodded, the pieces slowly clicking into place. "Yeah, that's where I remember you from," he said. "My kid brother's school held a career day last month. You were one of the speakers." Jamal nodded, feeling a small sense of relief wash over him. But the cold stare from Michaels was still there, her eyes boring into him like ice picks. She stepped forward, her expression hardening even more. "I don't care where he's been," she spat. "He fits the profile, and he's driving a car that looks just like the one reported stolen last week." Davis glanced at the superior officer for guidance, but the superior officer's expression remained unreadable, his hand still clutching his radio. Davis then insisted that they need to run this properly. "This might not be the guy we've been looking for," he said, his voice firm but measured. But Michaels wasn't listening. Her eyes remained locked on Jamal, her jaw clenched in anger. A lifetime of built-up bias was in her mind, flashing back to the lessons her father had drilled into her since she was a child. Black men in fancy cars are criminals. She could hear her father's cruel voice in her mind, saying words she had tried to forget but couldn't shake. This was more than a traffic stop for her. This was a fight to prove herself, to uphold the ugly beliefs she had carried for far too long. Jamal could see it in her face. Her hatred wasn't just professional, it was personal. She wasn't seeing him as a college student or a neighbor or even a human being. To her, he was just another stereotype, one she'd been taught to despise. And that's when something inside Jamal snapped. He took a breath and stood taller, his voice calm but firm. "You're not listening," he said, his eyes locked on Michael's. "You're not hearing me." Michael's eyes filled with anger, but before she could say anything, Davis stepped in between them. "Let's take a step back," he said, his voice calm and measured. "We need to run this properly." The superior officer nodded silently, his hand still clutching his radio. Michaels, however, remained furious, her fists clenching at her sides. But she said nothing as Davis quickly moved to check Jamal's registration and run the plates. Time seemed to move slowly, each second feeling like an hour, as Jamal stood there feeling like the weight of the world was on him. He could see Michael's tense body, with anger just below the surface, ready to explode. This wasn't just about the car or the supposed hacker. This was about something far deeper, something uglier. Finally, Davis returned, holding the results on his handheld device. "The car is clean," he said quietly. "Registration checks out. No reports of it being stolen." Jamal exhaled slowly, the weight lifting slightly from his chest. But it wasn't over. He could still feel Michael's eyes on him, burning with anger. "I told you," he said, his voice firm but measured. "You had the wrong guy." The superior officer sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as the tension drained from the situation. "Looks like we made a mistake here," he said, his voice laced with apology. Michael's, on the other hand, looked like she was about to explode. "This doesn't make sense," she snapped, glaring at Jamal as if the truth was somehow his fault. "He fits the profile. He must be hiding something." Davis shook his head, his voice firm now. "Michaels, let it go," he said. "We were wrong. This isn't our guy." But Michaels wasn't ready to let it go. Years of hatred, built on the foundation of her abusive father's teachings, boiled over in her. She wasn't just a cop right now. She was the result of her father's toxic legacy, and she was about to break under the weight of it. Suddenly, the superior officer spoke, his voice cold. "Michaels, that's enough. Stop." For a moment, it seemed like Michaels might not listen. Her hand hovered near her holster, and she was breathing fast and hard. Then, as if she understood how serious the situation was, she stopped. Slowly, her hand dropped to her side, but her eyes never left Jamal, and the hatred there was unmistakable. The superior officer's voice softened slightly as he addressed Jamal. "We'll get this sorted out," he said. "You're free to go, sir." But Jamal wasn't done. He wasn't going to just walk away from this. "You think this is sorted out?" he asked, his voice stronger now. "You targeted me because of the color of my skin. You didn't check the facts. You just assumed." The neighbors, who had been watching silently, began to talk amongst themselves. The reality of what had just happened settled over them. And then, to everyone's shock, Officer Michaels cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes as the weight of her father's bias and her own failures finally crushed her. Her voice shook as she said, "I was just doing my job."